Kia ora, everyone. My name's David Francis, and I'm the Senior Business Development Manager at Toitu Envirocare. I'll be your host for today's webinar, which is Decarbonising Transport and Logistics, a roadmap to Scope 3 and supplier data. So firstly, we know people are busy, so thanks so much for taking time to attend. This is a hugely important subject matter, and it requires a collective effort to resolve. We've got about 560 registrations, which is fabulous. So let's get into it. So I'm going to be joined by Lewis Porto and Steve Schultz. So Lewis is our technical advisor on emission reductions and neutrality. He supports organizations navigating value chain transitions and supplier engagement and supplier-specific data. Lewis is an environmental engineer with extensive commercial and cross-sector experience. Steve is our senior advisor at manufacturing and logistics. He supports clients in this space with measurement, setting targets, and pathway planning. Steve comes from an IT and business background and has been in the sustainability field for, 14 years? As an early EV adopter, he still remembers when an EV trip from Cambridge to Auckland involved 2 charging stops and a whole lot of coffee. And I'm a senior business development manager with Toitu, covering transport, energy, heavy manufacturing, and waste. My background is in process and materials engineering, and I've been in the renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainability worlds for 13 years now. So. Just a very brief intro to Toitu. We work with all sorts of organizations from SMEs through to large corporates, government departments, councils, non-profits, education. So we do cover the gamut of New Zealand organizations. We're a science-based organization. We're aligned with the SBTi and also the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And our carbon programs are all ISO certified. We've got a pretty solid track record. We've been doing this since 2001, 21 years in the business. We're a subsidiary of Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, which you might be aware is a Crown Research Institute of the New Zealand Government. And we've got 90 plus FTE at the moment, so a reasonably sized organisation as well. We're a big believer in rigour and science, and we ourselves are accredited by JASANS, which is the Joint Accreditation System of Australia and New Zealand. So they review our compliance and give us a license to operate. And we've had a lot of impact through the years. We've got 900 plus clients in New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. We've reduced over 8.5 million tonnes of CO2e, and we've offset another 1 million tonnes. And in 2022, our average member reductions were about 17%. So our systems work. And then lastly, we're aligned with our Achilles, our delivery partner in the UK, the International Emissions Trading Association, and the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance. So there are others as well. So that's the background of who we are, both as a company and the speakers. And with that, I will hand over to Lewis to discuss influences, levers, and the market drive for decarbonisation. Lewis, take it away.
Thank you very much, David. Wonderful. So we're going to start covering a little bit of the market context and the science and trends around this and what we're seeing in terms of lead practice. So it begins with the bigger picture. What's the bigger picture? In terms of climate science, we need to achieve globally is often translated into 1.5 degrees. Sometimes it's hard to grasp what actually 1.5 means. Often people think that you essentially put that on top of the temperature that you're feeling at the moment, but that's not quite accurate. The best way I found to describe to this day, it's like a fever. So the planet has a fever at the moment. So could you imagine yourself living with a constant 1.5 degrees fever? You probably would not last for long. That's the main reason why we need to sharply reduce pollution from fossil fuels and remove greenhouse gas emissions to stay within the limits and meet our targets of net zero by 2050. So that's kind of the overarching reason why we're doing this. Naturally, this will trigger a range of international and domestic commitments in the form of supply chain and legislative compliance. In New Zealand, some examples are that NZX-listed companies, financial institutions, and insurers are required to report their climate-related disclosures, often referred as the CRD. That's naturally linked to the Zero Carbon Act and the 2050 net zero country target we've got. When we think this in this perspective of the industry, the challenge is that the New Zealand transport sector produces 17% of domestic carbon emissions, and around a quarter of that is produced by trucks. So there's a lot of expectations in terms of efficiencies from the industry on the coming years. When we shift the spectrum to the international market, key markets such as the US and European Union are also implementing legal requirements and climate-related disclosures. Climate-related disclosures are also being rolled out in Australia, the UK, France, Brazil, Hong Kong, Japan, Canada, Singapore, and Switzerland. So there's a wide array of countries out there that are implementing mechanisms similar to the ones in New Zealand. Naturally, this will trigger down an influence through supply chain. And the key influence here is a top-down approach. So from the big players to the suppliers. The ask is to provide carbon emissions data and start the emission reduction journey. So and that's mainly because suppliers make a substantial part of their clients' carbon footprint. These asks will come through procurement and tender requests, for example. Lastly, but not less important, you have consumer expectations. So a good source of data around that is the Kantar Better Futures report, in which 2023 stated that 53% of New Zealanders are worried about climate change. That has been the highest ever, and after a quick dip around COVID. But a lot of people see also the correlation between what we experienced and all the disruption around COVID time and what's probably expected through climate change. Some examples of that that we can see in terms of extreme weather events and also consumer expectations are shown in the headlines. So we don't have to go that far to correlate with some of those events, like Cyclone Gabrielle that last summer hit at Auckland and Hawke's Bay. We recently had the Christchurch fires. We had the Nelson floods, Australian wildfires, and record-breaking temperatures. That's throughout the Northern Hemisphere, as well as New Zealand. We got some piece of news from last December, expecting that 2024 is probably going to be the hottest year on record. So the effects are coming quicker than anticipated. And from a social perspective, there are multiple examples of climate strikes locally and internationally. So essentially, it's a shift from a nice to have to a social license to operate. Linking back to the compliance and supply chain trigger effect, we have the US and European Union implementing things like CDP reporting, science-based target reductions, and product border mechanisms, respectively. So these are a wide array of systems and processes in place in order to address those challenges. This then triggers to major supermarkets implementing supply chain targets, for example, and national and international marketplace setting up the same expectations. So, as we said, it's no longer a matter of if, but of when we need to do this, and also refer as the illusion of choice. So we better get acting on this right now. On the results front, those are really promising. We have Walmart, for example, that started the supply engagement process back in 2017 after setting science-based targets. They counted with engagement of over 5,000 suppliers during this process, and 6 years later, they achieved 1 gigaton in emissions reductions avoided and offset, and we'll keep pushing for more. It's just a good example and emphasize that the results will come with time. They're not probably going to come in 1 year's time, but as long as you push this agenda forward, you're going to see this coming through. Your suppliers are most likely willing to work with you in this process. But naturally, there are challenges, right? And different parts of transport and logistics will face different challenges. Common to many is that low emissions technologies and infrastructure are not widely available. Fossil fuels are very energy dense and currently available, and finding suitable alternatives has been a challenge. The current approaches to transport goods are mature and well understood, with infrastructure and supply chain services well in place. Finally, the cost of change can be significant, particularly challenging in industries that operate with low margins. Yet, it can be easy to underestimate how much we can achieve in little time. For example, got to remember that the Paris Agreement is from 2015. That was the first time we actually agreed on paper through the COP system to reduce emissions on a global scale. That's 9 years ago. Renewable energy costs are falling in around 60 to 80% in the last 10 years, making it competitive with fossil fuel energy to this day. So also from a financial perspective, the shift is already happening. EVs, for example, they've experienced a 58% growth since 2010, and is projected to represent around 70% of worldwide vehicle sales by 2030. That's the 50% in 13 years. So really see across the board some really interesting examples of the shift that we're taking with time and effort. Later on, Steve will cover some greenhouse gas measurement elements such as why to measure, direct versus indirect emissions, and how to calculate your emissions. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Lewis. Very good. So measuring emissions. Let's just, oh, sorry, I'll just start my video. Okay, so that covers the sort of the high-level drivers and the why we need to make significant reductions. Let's have a look at sort of get down in the detail a bit. So here are just some of the drivers for measuring your emissions. Firstly, at a high level, the common mantra, you can't manage what you don't measure, is still very relevant. If you don't know where your emissions are coming from, then obviously reducing them will be somewhat hit or miss. Secondly, in addition to having a good understanding of your emissions, it will help you to identify where the hotspots are and where to make improvements. Finally, the process of selecting suppliers is becoming more stringent in many cases around sustainability performance. So businesses are frequently asking for sustainability related information in their selection processes, RFPs, and so on. And in some, having the right sustainability performance or credentials is a prerequisite to getting the work. So many of you may have seen these kinds of questions in tender documents and so on. So these are just a few of the reasons around why you should measure your emissions. But in general, remember that your customers, particularly the larger ones, will have their own targets and reduction goals. So as we'll see shortly, they will be looking to their supply chain to not only provide good data, but to also provide a lower emissions product or service to help them achieve those reductions. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. Our traditional approach to measuring emissions has largely focused on the core operational emissions, where we can more easily get the data and where we have direct control to make changes. So direct emissions come from sources owned or operated by the organization, such as combustion of fuel in a company vehicle, for example. But the net has really widened over the last couple of years to increase the focus on the indirect emissions. So those that occur in the operations of others. In other words, from sources not fully owned or controlled by the company. An example here would be the emissions from flying. The actual emissions occur on a plane owned and operated by an airline, but a proportion of those emissions are allocated to you. So this widened focus is frequently referred to as full value chain. You'll hear that term a lot these days. The other key thing to note is that your direct emissions will be included as indirect emissions in your customers' greenhouse gas inventories. So one company's direct emissions will be another company or multiple companies' indirect emissions. Now, as an aside, you might ask yourself, isn't that double counting? Well, it is, but given the nature of many of these emissions and the need for significant reductions, there's an advantage to having multiple organizations looking to reduce any given emissions together. And that multiple focus is also a great incentive for collaboration. Of course, one needs to be careful on the flip side in terms of removals, that we don't have multiple companies claiming the same removal in their climate performance claims. Now, once again, the bottom line here is that your customers are going to be more and more interested in your emissions and what you are doing about them. So looking at this focus on Scope 3 a bit more, remember that our primary objective with all of this is to collectively move from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. So if your organization is going to survive and thrive in that new world, then you're going to have to change how you do things and make significant emission reductions across your full value chain. Now, if you're familiar with science-based targets, you'll know that in order to stay within the 1.5 degree limit, we need to reduce emissions. We call it net zero, but in essence, it's a 90 to 95% reduction by 2050. And to reach those levels, we need to reduce by around 43% by 2030. So that's just 7 years away. In particular, New Zealand's first emissions reduction plan states that our freight system will need to emit 35% fewer emissions by 2035 compared to 2019. So that's definitely no easy task. Now, research has shown that for many industries, their upstream emissions alone, i.e. those owned and controlled by their supply chain, are on average 11 times their core operational emissions. And that's not to mention the downstream emissions caused by your organization. So we often use the iceberg analogy to show that an organization's direct emissions are just a small part of their overall impact. So based on that, it makes sense to have a really good understanding of those indirect emissions, because they both represent a substantial area of opportunity for organizations to take action, but they're also a significant portion of those emissions that need to be designed out to achieve a low carbon business model. And building on the previous slide, your customers will be relying on you to help them achieve their transition to a low carbon business model. For those of you who are new to carbon accounting, we'll take a quick look at how we measure emissions. And the key point here, or the starting point here, is around emission factors. We have the definition on screen here. But the key thing to note with emission factors is that they enable a straightforward calculation of the actual emissions based on activity data. So liters, kilometers, etc. So the hard work has been done in the building of those emission factors and defining the calculations and the variables used. And that makes the emission factors very simple to use. Now, emission factors will vary in accordance or in accuracy, depending on the variables used and the complexity. Some will be fairly accurate. For example, the combustion of a liter of diesel, while others will be based on industry averages and include numerous other assumptions. So the result of this is that emission factors, although easy to use, will seldom be 100% accurate, and they generally have a level of uncertainty in them. So here's a couple of examples of how emission factors are used. Most emission factors are what we call single variable. So where you have one single item of activity data multiplied by an emission factor to give the actual emission. So an example is petrol. If you were to buy and then combust 1 litre, you would multiply that by the factor 2.45 to give 2.45 kgs of CO2e. Likewise, for air travel, a single passenger doing air travel, you would multiply the distance traveled by that passenger by the factor per kilometer to give the emissions. Now, when there are two things to think about when both calculating your emissions and looking for reductions. The first is the activity level, so how much you are doing of something. So that might be kilometers driven, kilowatt hours of electricity used, and so on. And the second component is the greenhouse gas intensity. So the more carbon intensive an activity is, the higher the overall greenhouse gas emissions. Think petrol car versus EV, for example. Now, the combination of these two then gives us the actual greenhouse gas emission. Now, the activity and the greenhouse gas intensity are your key levers to decarbonize. In some ways, the activity lever can be often translated into a behavioral or operational change. So, for example, taking more efficient route, driving more efficiently, and so on. While the intensity lever is often a technological change. For example, switching to a more efficient or lower emitting option like EVs, hydrogen, and so on. Now, under that scenario, you may still be doing the same number of kilometers, but if the greenhouse gas emissions or if the intensity is lower, the overall emissions will be lower. Now, of course, pulling both levers can maximize your reductions. So this leads on to choosing the best emission factor for your particular activity. As we mentioned above, different emission factors will have different levels of accuracy. Some are more specific to the activity than others. Some will be based on general industry averages, for example, fuel efficiency across all HGVs, while others may be based on more granular data, for example, specific truck types. So better accuracy can often be obtained by going from emission factors that cover a range of vehicle types, for example, to ones that are specific to the actual vehicle type used. And even better results can be had by moving from generic emission factors based on industry average and so on, to more supplier-specific ones that are based on actual details, such as fuel used for each trip and so on. So this example on the screen here, we can see that we have a range of factors to choose from for road freight, where all the grey lines represent different sized trucks and vans. The red bars indicate what we call the industry or the default average for different categories, while the green bars indicate the intensity of specific suppliers that the reporting organization is in this example was using. So we can see that there's quite a variation across different available emission factors for the same activity, and in many cases having an emission factor specific to your activity is preferable. So as we've seen, emission factors can be calculated in different ways with different inputs and different levels of complexity. And this leads us to the concept of the method hierarchy, with the idea being that moving up this hierarchy can be used to improve both completeness and accuracy. So here we have 4 of the more commonly used calculation methods for transport. Now with this example, down at the bottom there, we have spend-based factors, and we can expect spend-based factors to have the lowest accuracy, as they'll be based on a range of industry averages for fuel consumption, loading rates, and in particular, ton kilometers per dollar spend. Now, dollar spend may be easy to source since it comes straight out of your accounting system, but because it's based on different averages, including regularly changing costs, it will be less accurate and unlikely to be specific to the actual freight service that you used. So the other major drawback, of course, when using spend-based factors, is the only way to show reductions and reduce emissions based on dollar spend will be to spend less. So it's not a very good indicator of where you can achieve reductions. From our experience, most companies can jump onto this hierarchy at the distance method for freight using what's called ton-kilometer data, which is basically the weight multiplied by distance multiplied by the industry average emissions per ton-kilometer. So then we have the what we call the hybrid method, and the hybrid method uses a combination of supplier-specific activity data where available and secondary data. And then the final method and preferred method is, in this case, fuel-based, or in more generic terms, we could call it supplier-specific, where, for example, you're accounting for the actual fuel use for your share of the load. So we refer to this improved accuracy as specificity. Well, quite a mouthful, but in other words, using data that is more specific to an organization's actual activities. Now, our expectation is that as many organizations start to extend out into measuring the full value chain, they will often start out using lower accuracy spend-based factors and then improve over time by moving up to those better calculation methods. Now, the reason for this is that getting this level of data is not always easy, and it leads to the topic of supplier engagement, which Luis will pick up and cover in more detail.
Thanks, Steve. Wonderful. So as covered before, given that a large part of your emissions come from your supply chain, making the supply engagement process quite critical for success. And as we saw before in some examples, it pays off. So the first step is that you need to identify your material suppliers. So prioritize magnitude and relationship. You got to work with your suppliers that represent the biggest emission sources, as well as prioritizing the ones you have the best relationship with. Often, organizations will start this with a value chain screening on a spend-based measurement, as Steve alluded before. In other words, where money flows, it's likely is going to be where your highest emissions are. The second point is that as part of the screening, you'll likely require spend data from your finance and procurement teams. And that also touches on the point of reviewing procurement policies. So in terms of the third point is in terms, once you set your priority list, you got to ask your suppliers and get them in the journey. Meet them where they're at. So what's available now? And if not, when will that be available? Often suppliers will be open to working with you and fit your needs. Then if you are able to get some direct supplier specific emissions data for freight mode, for example, that's great. For road freight, the best data available would be liters of fuel for your share of the load. So an example to achieve that is through fuel cards and telemetric equipment, for example. Alternatively, weight in tons and kilometers might allow you to use industry averages. So check if the data provided is at the right level, it's pre-calculated and pre-verified, for example. At Toitu, as part of our member support, we appraise suppliers' emissions report. It can also support their calculations for a wider use. Then we move on in checking what's your supplier appetite for setting reduction targets themselves. So what's their plan and what level of commitment can your supplier make with you? The last point is to follow up. Setting up the next catch-up, when are we meeting next, and what are we agreeing on? So that frequency is quite important for you to see some progress. Moving on, and the main reason to seek supply-specific data is regarding what the long-term outlook in terms of reduction is. So in this example, we have a road freight, and the top line shows the actual industry average emissions published by MFA. There's only a small change of around 0.7% decrease, because essentially all industry players are put in the same bucket. So projecting this over time, the emission factor will show a shallow downward trend to 2030. In contrast, with an actual supplier specific factor, let's imagine your supplier is a leader in the industry and is applying efficiencies such as the latest truck models, driver training, alternative fuels, etc. You're probably going to start off at a lower intensity than the industry average. Secondly, is that if that supplier is chasing their own emission reduction target, we can project a much steeper downward trend on a ton-kilometer focus. So the key message here is that by moving your emissions calculations from an industry average to supply-specific data, you have the potential to open up greater visibility, and by that, greater reduction potential. The other key point is that using a high-level emission factors to measure, such as a spend-based data, as Steve alluded to, you are limiting your reduction opportunity by only spending less. So it's like not you have heaps of options in terms of efficiency out there. That's why starting from a spend base to screen your supply chain, understanding where the hotspots are, and then focusing on supply-specific data to then bake in those reductions. It's quite crucial. I'll hand over to David next to discuss some of the current and future solutions.
Thanks, Lewis. So I want to touch briefly on the reduction actions you can look at today and also into the future. A disclaimer, though, this is a huge topic and we can't possibly cover it off in this webinar. This could cover a two-day webinar on its own. But the point is to essentially open up the possibility for you to look at some options and engage with the industry to see where you can go. So basically, reductions available today really do center around operational excellence of existing fleets. And that is substantially data-driven. There are some amazing platforms out there now to collect data and optimize your operation of your fleet. There's gains to be made in terms of vehicle optimization and making sure that your aerodynamics are optimized, your weight reduction is the best it can be, your maintenance is fully up to scratch, you know, your tire pressures are right on point. All of those things feed into emissions reductions. There's some gains to be made around fleet optimization. Are you right-sizing your vehicles? Are you using the right-sized vehicle for the job in hand? Is your fleet as modernized as it could be? Now, even now in today's environment, there is room for some electrified vehicles, certainly in terms of buses, urban delivery, rubbish recycling, which is a high start-stop type application, micro deliveries using cargo-based cycles, for example. Can you optimize your route? Have you got the right software to give you the very best route optimization to minimize your kilometers driven? Have you optimized your loading to make sure that the trucks are as full as they can be always? Have you looked at alternative transport modes that might make more sense? And this is a huge one, driver training. Are your drivers performing to the optimum level? Because there's many percentages worth of gain just in that one there. Things are happening in the space already. This graphic here is quite interesting. This just goes to show the growth of electric buses in New Zealand really in the last, 3 or 4 years. So we've gone from less than 50 on fleet to close to 300 on fleet in a period of 3 years. So this space is evolving really, really fast. There's all sorts of examples of initial electrification going on. This is all in New Zealand. So we've got electrified buses everywhere. We've got urban delivery everywhere. We're at the very early stages of electrifying aviation, although it's very early stage. Electric forklifts are common, electric ferries. and electric tugs. So it is all happening. There's a lot going on out there, and this is all current tech right out there in the market right now. But in the near future, this is where it gets really interesting. The important thing to emphasize is that one size doesn't fit all. There are lots of potential solutions out there, and they all have different use cases. So it's really critical to match the use case to the technology. There has been various initiatives through the years to try and build out the biofuel market in New Zealand. At one point, it was mandated a few governments ago, and then that got taken away. But most modern diesel engines can run on at least B5 and possibly up to B20. There's some really interesting tech around dual fuel. So this is not a drop-in fuel. This is a situation where a vehicle uses two different fuel sources within the same engine. And that can be done with natural gas, hydrogen, green methanol, or ammonia. One of the big advantages of that is that the amount of modifications required to the vehicle are minimized compared with buying a brand new vehicle. Hydrogen is a really interesting one. There's some dedicated hydrogen solution possibilities. It really, really strongly suits kind of a point-to-point type infrastructure where you've got a large truck movements or vehicle movements from one depot to another. And then that allows you to build a very limited amount of hydrogen infrastructure to fuel those vehicles. Electrification of the short range fleet, that's happening now and will continue to happen. That's achievable right now. Electrification of the long range fleet is a real challenge, and there needs to be more enablers to be in place before that's going to happen. And that needs to be around longer lasting batteries, depot-based mega chargers, battery swap solutions. Truck platooning is an interesting tech that they've tried overseas, where trucks basically drive in convoy and minimize fuel consumption that way. This slide here, all I'm trying to illustrate here is that basically there's a lot going on in the hydrogen space in New Zealand, and I don't expect you to be able to read that graphic, but it does illustrate that there are lots of initiatives building out hydrogen in New Zealand. So it will be one of the solutions going forward, along with electrification and some of the other things we tabled. So just on a lighter note, to wrap things up here before Q&A, question: how many consultants does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is none, because the light bulb is now LED and it hardly ever needs changing. And the point I'm making here is that 8 to 10 years ago, when LED lighting first hit the market, the bulbs were 4 times as expensive as traditional bulbs, and no one ever did it. Now, a few years later, it has become the standard de facto solution. So technology changes really fast, and it's very, very important that that we basically keep our eye on the ball and make sure that we're evaluating technology changes frequently every year, because what doesn't make sense last year or this year may well make sense next year. And so basically we need to make sure that we're not asleep at the wheel. So that pretty much wraps up the presentations, and we can bounce into Q&A now. I will stop sharing my screen and bounce into some questions and answers, if we could. The first one from Jeremy McLeod. Are there any initiatives from the government on the cards to incentivize a move to more efficient yet more costly heavy transport options? There's still an issue where companies with poor performing fleets are undercutting those trying to do the right thing in terms of emissions. Good question. A political question. Steve or Lewis, anyone keen? If not, I'll have a go at that one.
I think what I would like to mention, something that we couldn't quite fit in the slides, was around one of the alternatives that's being looked at is renewable freight certificates. which is it's a market-based solutions to look at heavy transport. So in other words, working similar to what the renewable energy certificates for electricity happens, where you can pay a premium to benefit on a lower intensity service. So a similar process is being explored to roll out in New Zealand, and that should potentially help with their heavy transport options by helping to finance new alternatives for those industry players.
Cool. I would just add on to that we're obviously in the process of transitioning between governments, and so the policies are also changing. But prior to the new government, ECA was launching a electric truck trial program. I'm not sure what the funding situation is on that currently, but I would encourage you all, if you're interested in that, to reach out to ECA and ask the question and see what facilities are available there.
And I think the other element is that if you have a freight provider or supplier in general that is performing better than the industry, that also loops back to the whole procurement process and how can you embed this as part of your contractual instruments. We know that procurement is not something that you're going to change regularly, but it's a good time to revise and include some of those policies as part of that.
So another question, Morena, this is from an anonymous person. So we are a small government mandated organisation. What do you suggest as the government tightens its belt with funding? This has a flow-on effect to organisations like ourselves. We must still travel for our mahi, but we may not be in a position to offset carbon credits. What are the alternatives to offsetting? Gents?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. I think I would basically just go back to a number of those things that you mentioned earlier, David, around, in terms of freight, fleet optimization, etc. But in terms of other business-related travel, the organizations are doing things like setting carbon budgets for air travel, higher levels of sign-off for things like air travel. So yes, when the funding is tight, we have to kind of look at all those different options around trying to reduce the travel where we can. But yeah, it's not an easy one.
When looking at one of the points that Steve covered earlier in this presentation was around the activity times the intensity of the activity, which is often referred as a behavior change or a technology change. So if you can't address the technology element because you still got to travel, maybe I can't change the fuel that's used on the planes, for example, maybe I can look at the behavior side of things. So if I do have to travel, can I travel in a more efficient way? For example, instead of going for one meeting, I'll make a travel whenever I have 3 meetings set up, or these type of efficiencies, which we try to apply ourselves for our own work. So offsetting should be kind of the last option, really. The first option is to avoid the emission per se. So you've got to ask yourself, do I really need to perform that activity? And then the second point is to reduce. So if I have to perform the activity, can I perform in a less intensive way or a more efficient way?
Yeah, great. I would just add a comment to that we're big supporters of reduction. Our carbon programs focus firstly on reduction before we encourage the use of carbon credits. The next question from Forrest Jin. Hi, a supplier usually has a large number of customers. How to quantify the share of emissions by supplier to a company? Who's feeling like they're to that?
I can take it, Greg. It will often translate into your share of the load. So how many tons in terms of freight, for example, how many tons of product you're shipping with that freight supplier. So if they can get like a per function unit for how many tons, so essentially the intensity of, we burn X amount of fuel for X amount of tons that we transport throughout this period of time, and you use Y amount of tons you shipped with us, for example. So there's ways to kind of divvy up those totals on a per client basis.
Thanks, Lewis.
Nice.
Question from Jeffy Palamatam. If we are Toitū certified and initially started supply chain emission calculations based on industry factors, but got supplier-specific data once the supplier matured in emissions calculations, do we need to change past calculations which were based on industry emissions factors? And I believe Steve's got this one covered.
Yes. So, Jeffy, that's good that you've picked up on the discussion around the intention to move up the method hierarchy over time. And if you consider that one of the reasons for having an inventory is that you are comparing progress over a number of years, and so it does mean that for purposes of comparability under both the ISO standard and the greenhouse gas protocol, when your circumstances change, and that includes changes in the methods that you've used, can result in needing to do a base year recalculation. In terms of our upcoming program changes, we will also be looking at split base years, but in principle, in order to keep that comparability, if the changes brought about by those changes in the method that you're using are more than a certain threshold, so it depends on your recalculation statement, or in most cases around 5%. If it's more than that, then yes, you may need to recalculate prior year's data.
Thanks, Steve. The next question is an anonymous one. Excuse me. What is the governing methodology or ISO standard to international transport emissions for sea freight and air freight?
ISO standard, they recently published one specific for freight. I don't recall exactly which one is it. I think it's 14083, if I'm not mistaken, but we can go back to that specific one, Steve, if you do know the exact jump in. But kind of the governing methodology on an international aspect is also called the GLAC framework. I'll have to spell it out, the whole acronym, but that's essentially backed up by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol alongside the Smart Freight Center. And these guys work together and come up with kind of the reduction levels necessary for maritime and air travel in the general sense. Yeah, so the GLAC framework is probably the most well recognized.
Yeah, Dennis, you're correct. The ISO 14083
Yes.
it talks about global logistics, but I will need to dig down into the detail.
Yeah, memory's still working.
You travel.
Thanks, gents. The next question is anonymous. If our company has an electric vehicle, how should we classify the charge emission? That is the electric vehicle charge pay around the city. Will it be included in the electricity emission? So I think essentially what they're saying is, if they use the charge net or something like that, how is that accommodated?
So if you're charging on site, that would be captured by your electricity consumption naturally. So don't have to include this, let's say, externally. If you are charging in a station, you can often get invoices and like kilowatt hours of how much was used for that charge, and you can make them the multiplication by that and the grid factor, so the kind of true electricity lenses. But there are also I guess other ways to calculate if you don't get the kilowatt hour. Steve, do you have any addition to that?
Yeah, it can be a tricky one. As you've mentioned, generally, ChargeNet and people like that you'll be able to download the actual kilowatt hours used. One of the ones that does get tricky is charging from home. And often some organizations will put in, for example, specific meters on home-based charges for company vehicles. But often you have to just think about the materiality. You know, if you've got a couple of people using an EV at home, it may or may not be worth the effort to pin down those exact figures. But in terms of reporting it, yeah, if it was company-based charging, it's in your scope 2. Otherwise, it would be included under business travel in category, you know, in your scope 3.
Thanks, Steve. Another question is around biofuels. Biofuels are slated as a great drop-in option, but it is difficult to procure sustainable biofuels. Is the government or other organisations looking to bring this to New Zealand? I don't think the government is. The private fuel companies may look at it, but it will probably depend on there being mandates or commercial demand for that to occur. Are there any suggestions for hard-to-abate emissions? With your new direction on the NZ units, it looks like domestic offsetting is off the table if a corporate wants to retire credits voluntarily.
I think it's alluding to the fact that our recent change in policies around the use of domestic carbon credits. It's important to remember that a carbon credit will have kind of equal value in a way, regardless if that's a project established in New Zealand or internationally. It's a collective global effort towards it. So there's still alternatives to use international markets carbon credits, and we're still open to work with the domestic market. There's just some requirements in terms of the quality of those credits and those projects. But yeah, we're open to keep working with the market in the near future. I think there's any other comments from David or Steve?
No, not really.
David, I think the previous question was saying about legislation around transport and logistics, and because it's not mandated, when should we expect those mandates to kind of cover those industries, I suppose? I believe that's they're trying to say. My comment around that is the climate-related disclosures is a scheme that was established looking at those top players to begin with, but the XRB, which is governing that mandate, is looking at triggering down to other industry players as well. So it's expected that a wider array of organizations will be included as part of the climate-related disclosures in the near future. So yeah, I would expect that this will capture transport and logistics as well. And on the flip side, there will be many organizations requiring information to those suppliers, right? So it's that kind of collective effort that we mentioned again that will trigger some traction.
And we've probably got time for one more. It's almost 11 now, so let's quickly knock this one on the head. Considering the geography of New Zealand, would truck platooning for road freight work here? Hard to answer because the platooning tech is still very early stage, but certainly around Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch, where you've got sort of nice, clear, straight motorways, it's more likely to be successful, but it's very early days in that tech, so it's a bit hard to be definitive. So guys, that brings us pretty much to 11 o'clock, which is the end of the road for us, pardon the pun. So again, thanks so much for your attendance. It's a complicated subject. Hopefully we did demystify as much of it as we can, and let's all push forward and see what we can do. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Cheers.